All right, well, thank you. I'm just so pleased that we can all be here together tonight for this. I am the Director of Education here at the museum, which means I get to do a lot of different kinds of things. And it's my pleasure to be able to do this introduction tonight. I've also had the great privilege of working on this exhibition with the committee, and it's been an amazing experience. And hopefully through the things that you'll hear tonight and maybe some of the other experiences you can have leading up to the exhibit, it'll give you a taste of what's coming there. So I'm very glad to share this experience with you, and thank you all for being here. The panel discussion this evening is part of a speaker series connected to our upcoming exhibit, Finding Our Voices, Sister Survivors Speak. Please note that both the panelists' remarks and the Q&A session will be videotaped and posted online. So the videos of all the roundtables will be available on our website, museum.msu.edu, so you can check the site for the links there. Also, we want everyone to know there's another great event tonight at the museum. Vidhu Agarwal from Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, will be discussing narrative entropy by looking at ancient texts in relation to contemporary cosmology and technology to get at the contextualization of perpetual war and perpetual crisis. So this event is going to be upstairs in the Habitat Hall from 7 to 8 o'clock. So turning now to tonight's discussion panel. In the past, I've had the chance to teach the Social Studies Methods course here at MSU for students who are earning their K-12 teaching credentials. And one of the best parts of that class was helping to expose students to new methods of teaching and ways to explore ideas with their future students. One thing that always came up in our classes was how to teach difficult topics such as injustice, war, and racism. Finding Our Voice presents a difficult topic. This topic, sexual assault and the responsibility of institutions and society for responding to it and stopping it, it's a difficult topic. As in the classroom, it's important that we don't shy away from these topics, that we don't allow wrongdoing to be ignored, and that the voices of those who are most impacted be heard, believed, and responded to. This is how we create change and foster healing. Further, I believe that this is one of the most important things that teachers can do for their students, to expose them to the idea that we don't have to live with the realities that we experience, that we can change things. Finding Our Voices says, we don't accept this. We do not tolerate this reality. This exhibit tells the story of survivors, it opens dialogues, and it shines a bright light for hope and healing. Inspired by hundreds of teal bows and ribbons that were tied around campus trees in early 2018, the exhibit is the result of a community co-collaboration curatorial process. A committee of sister survivors and their families have joined with museum staff members to highlight the continued struggle to heal, challenge injustice, demand institutional accountability, and build a better world free of sexual assault. We are so grateful to the committee and to others for this shared experience that the developing exhibit has offered to us. And it's also opened up a lot of opportunities for new understandings and the support that Finding Our Voice promises to offer many people. So the exhibit opens April 16th, and we hope that you will be able to see that. So tonight, also I want to be able to thank our partner for the Spring Speaker Series, the Army of Survivors, and co-sponsors at the College of Communication Arts and Sciences, the College of Social Sciences, and the MSU Detroit Center. So tonight's panel is called Covering the Crisis, Journalism and Sexual Violence, and it will be moderated by Professor Susan Carter. So I'm going to say just a few words about her.
Before we get to that, Amanda's going to welcome us on behalf of the Army of Survivors.
That would be fabulous, please.
Yay, Amanda. Hi all, my name is Amanda. I am part of the Army of Survivors, and we thank you for being here first and foremost, and thank you for the museum for putting this on with us. These panels have meant so much to us, and we just really appreciate being able to get our voices out there and heard, as well as getting this topic circulated throughout media has been so important for us. Not only just for us, but for everybody else to be able to talk about these things and it not be such a taboo topic. So we look forward to hearing everything that everyone said tonight, and thank you for me personally and from the Army. We can't and wouldn't be here without you guys. It has been tremendous support. I know Mark had said earlier, there are some teal prayer flags back behind this wall and to the right. If you would like to sign when you're done, please feel free. But I will hand it over now. I think that's it. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, so our moderator this evening, Professor Sue Carter, is in the School of Journalism at MSU. She joined the faculty in 1991 after a 17-year career as a radio and TV news broadcaster and talk show host. Sue Carter also served as Secretary of the Board of Trustees and Executive Assistant to Presidents Peter McPherson and Luana Simon, and Press Secretary to the Governor James Blanchard. Her broadcasting has been recognized in Michigan and nationally, and her documentary work has earned her 4 Emmys. A graduate of MSU with a BA in Humanities, she earned a master's degree also, and a Juris Doctor from Wayne State University, and a Master of Divinity from the General Theological Seminary, and a Doctor of Ministry, interesting, from Seabury Western Theological Seminary. She is the Associate Rector of St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Lansing. And here's another interesting fact that Mark wanted to make sure I included, and I found it very interesting. Lets us know how much that Sue believes in women doing amazing things. In 2001, she organized and led the first all-women team to ski to the North Pole.
Wow.
So that's really amazing. So please join me in welcoming Sue Carter.
So it's such a lovely obituary. Thank you again very much. As has been mentioned, this is the 4th panel in Finding Our Voice, Sister Survivors Speak, organized by the Army of Survivors. And I think that's a very impressive way of putting it, because it is an army of survivors. This one is in partnership with Michigan State University's museum. The series presented by the museum in conjunction with an exhibit of the same title that will open on Tuesday, April 16th, here in the museum. For this panel, we are joined by journalists who covered Nassar's crimes, trial, and conviction, and the university's response. So, welcome to covering the crisis, journalism, and sexual violence. Let me just briefly give the names, and then I'll have a short bio of our individuals. Kate Wells is here from Michigan Radio. Kim Kozlowski from the Detroit News. Matt Mencarini, who is with the Lansing State Journal only shortly, traveling soon. Traveling soon. Alexandra Illitch, who is now with Veracity. Judith Waldron, MSU School of Journalism. Reginald Hardwick, who is with WKAR. Joanne Gerstner, and Grace French with the Army of Survivors. And I am your moderator. So let me give a brief bio sketch so you know the individuals who have been working diligently over more than a year and a half, 2 years, in some instances, covering this story. First, Kate Wells. Kate is a reporter with Michigan Radio, NPR. She co-hosts the NPR podcast Believed, which averages 250,000 downloads per episode and hit the #1 spot on Apple charts last year. For the last few years, her work has covered the Nassar case and Michigan State University. Kim Kozlowski has been a reporter for more than 30 years, working at daily newspapers in upstate New York, North Dakota, Kansas City. She currently is a higher education reporter at the Detroit News, where she has been covering the sex abuse scandal here at Michigan State since January of 2017. Her most important story was titled What MSU Knew, and you may recall that is an account of 8 young women who told someone at MSU about Nassar before he was brought to justice. Kim also wrote the first story about the teal ribbons that many of us saw recently tied around trees on MSU's campus honoring the survivors. And it led to conversations about finding our voice, Sister Survivors Speak. Matt Mencarini, the criminal justice reporter for 3 more days, at the Lansing State Journal.
Yeah.
Off to a wonderful job in Louisville. He has covered the Larry Nassar case and the fallout at MSU since September of 2016, in addition to other stories about sexual violence, trauma, and the criminal justice system's response. Alexandra Illitch, seated here up front, an award-winning freelance investigative journalist who worked at WLNS-TV in Lansing for 4 years, where she extensively covered the Larry Nassar scandal. To this day, she continues to follow the story and to uncover truths about who knew what and when they knew it about Nassar. She's honored to help give a voice to the voiceless and strives to help make a difference in communities. MSU J School Professor of Practice Judy Waldron is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist, and we'll see some of her work. Also a photo editor, executive producer, curator, writer, and teacher. She has worked on staffs at the Dallas Morning News, the Rocky Mountain News, the Denver Post, and the San Francisco Chronicle. That's where she was director of photography, leading a staff of Emmy Award-winning filmmakers, photojournalists, and photo editors. Walgren also served as the editorial director for a visual storytelling startup called Viewfind, which connected large brands of photos, editors, photographers, writers, and designers who created branded visual narratives for both digital and print platforms, and we'll see some of her work on those. While at the Chronicle, she received an MFA in Visual Arts from the Vermont College of Fine Arts. Reginald Hardwick, also seated up front, digital news director for WKAR Public Media, leading the news content for radio, TV, and digital platforms. Before joining WKAR in March of 2017, Hardwick was award-winning producer and executive producer in Dallas and in Denver. Born in Vietnam, raised in Colorado, spending summers in Ann Arbor. It's okay, Rich. To add to the accolades, may I mention also that Reginald Station was just named the Michigan Association of Broadcasters Public Station of the Year. Congratulations. And Joanne C. Gerstner, MSU School of Journalism, sports journalist in residence and co-anchor, co-leader of the Sports Journalism and Minor program. Also an award-winning sports journalist and author who has covered the Olympics, the U.S. Olympic Committee, female athletes, international sports for more than 2 decades for outlets including ESPN, the New York Times, USA Today, and the Detroit News. Clearly a sterling panel, and we welcome them all. So Kate, let me begin with you. If you come on out. Oh yeah. Talk about the podcast and everything else that went into it, please.
Sure. Hey guys, I just want to apologize first off because I have a 7-month-old at home and I have the worst mom brain for the last 3 weeks that I've ever. This morning I woke up and I put the croutons in the freezer overnight, and the day before I left my keys in the front door overnight and was late to work because I could not find my keys. So just to set your expectations of how good this is gonna be. So I want to start off by actually just telling you a little bit about, not the podcast, but about this BBC documentary. It's called Abused, The Untold Story. I don't know if any of you guys have seen it. It's online. It's really short. It's 90 minutes. It's worth checking out. And it's about the kids who were, now adults, who were abused as children by Jimmy Savile. I don't know if you read about that while this was happening. This BBC celebrity and major philanthropist. More than now 400 people have come forward as survivors. And it's this really human and beautiful film. It's 90 minutes. Go see it. The filmmaker is a guy named Ollie Lambert. And what's interesting about this film is that the vast majority of it is actually in people's living rooms, their kitchens, their schools. They're just on their laptops or in their phones or in the car. And Ollie Lambert talks about making this movie. And I actually, when I came across what he said about it, I printed it off on a very now crumbled piece of paper, and it's been over my desk for the last 2 years. So I just want to read you a little bit about what he says when he's talking about interviewing and being in the lives of people who were abused as kids. He says, "Our job is to move a case towards justice. We are not the court of justice, but we can be part of reaching for justice." He says, "I felt unworthy of the task at hand. I felt guilty asking people to unpack their lives and unearth their pain. I had absorbed their feelings and I was carrying them around with me. I was never going to be able to take away their pain. and I couldn't make promises to make it better. But I could be respectful and truthful. I could listen with empathy and use that to make their experiences as visceral and understandable as possible. And the last thing he says is that was ultimately what they wanted, to be heard and understood and believed. And then when I read that about a year ago, it felt like the first time somebody else had verbalized all the ways that I felt inadequate, terrified to be trying to cover this story in any way that's added to what mattered about it, rather than just sort of jumped on the bandwagon or sensationalized things. And it was especially, I think it was kind of our North Star when we did start Believed, because it at first seemed like a really bad idea. I mean, Larry Nassar was already in prison at the time. The sentencing had been months ago. Most of the big national media had kind of moved on from the breathless coverage. It seemed like MSU was starting to be held accountable. And what we were proposing doing and calling up these women and girls and doing was saying, hey, can you once again stop living your normal day-to-day busy lives? Can you let us into your homes and your living rooms and your schools and unearth your pain all over again? But not just you, your kids, your parents, your spouses, and just trust us that we are going to do a good job with this and we're not going to use you and it's going to be worth doing all of this again. And I will be honest, I'm still not totally sure why so many of them said yes, except that two things were true of all of them: a generosity of spirit and a desire that we learn something from this, that this not be just a pattern that keeps repeating over and over again. And I think something that I learned when I got to go back all of these months later, many times to women who we had talked to and they had been interviewed about a million bajillion times. One thing that I learned is that they never stop reliving it when they're talking about it. And I think that's so important for people to remember when we talk about, well, why doesn't somebody come forward, or why don't we see more stories like this earlier? We really witnessed these women go back in time. And I think if you listen to Believed, you can hear them, even when they were just talking to us, in their bedrooms, underneath gymnastics posters. They relive it when they talk about it. And the other thing that really surprised us and that we learned from it is that even though we now think of the Larry Nassar case as over in many ways, and that this guy was obviously a serial sexual predator, everyone knows this, for many of the ones who had not been believed, not only did they relive the experience of the abuse, but that not being believed part of it also stayed with them and messed with their realities and their minds in a way that we didn't understand at first. Like, we'd literally be talking to somebody and they'd be saying, "You believe me, right?" And like, this is last July. And we would just sit there silently like, of course we believe you. But it's that permanent when you spend years of your life thinking that you were either crazy or wrong, or having people tell you that you were crazy or wrong. So it's this exhausting process of both communicating your pain and experiencing it and second-guessing yourself, and doing it because you hope that something larger comes out of this. And I think that same generosity that let us into their living rooms and their homes, et cetera, is what makes these stories affect people so much. I think when you listen to these women talk, you don't just hear them as sort of these, I guess now almost stereotypes of quote-unquote survivors. You see them and hear them being funny and having dark senses of humor and being messy. And we are all people. And when we get to show the people who have gone through these experiences in that same way, as not defined by this, I think in some ways that has power to reach people who would otherwise be skeptical or feel that this is an issue that doesn't impact them. So I guess my point here is a lot of gratitude to the people who took that time and gave us that time and emotional energy, and that it's when these stories are successful or when they reach people, it's not necessarily because of the reporters who did it. It is because the people in them really did that real work. So thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. It's not easy to do the task that you did, but you did it. Kim Kozlowski reported on an awful lot. We saw her stories, we read them in the Detroit News. Kim, let me turn to you.
Hello. Wow, I'm going after Kate. Uh-oh. Thank you so much for having me this evening. I appreciate this wonderful crowd. As you know, my name is Kim, and I'm a reporter in Detroit. And I wanted to talk to you. I made a slide presentation just to kind of show you some things that we went through and things we talked about. And I'm going to talk a little bit about journalism along the way so you understand why we make the decisions that we did, and some of the struggles we had as reporters along the way, but also some of the triumphs too. So, is this first button right? I've been a reporter for 30 years, at least. And I've lived in many different places. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because as journalists, we often think of ourselves as chroniclers of the first draft of history. And for as long as I've been in journalism, I have never, ever stayed on a story for a solid year and a half. And it's all I've ever done. We've certainly followed, as a reporter, we all follow stories. We write a story, next day we're on to something new, we may come back to a story, but I have never, ever written a story. So it's been an unprecedented time for me personally, and I know also for a lot of my colleagues. I really believe this time in history is hard to see because we're so close to it, but I really believe when all the survivors came out and started talking and testifying in Ingham County, it was a seismic shift in time. And I'm going to tell you a story that I think is really telling. I wrote a story in December about how 4 days had been set aside for the survivors to come forward and testify. And about a week before, I was sitting in an office with my editor, Steve Murphy, this is my editor, and I said to him, "Do you think they're going to let me stay up there for 4 days?" And he said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, I recommend that we do. I'll have my computer. If something comes up, I can write it remotely." I thought that was so telling that I had to actually ask and recommend that I stay up there because I really don't think that anyone really knew what was coming. And here was the first court where it occurred, Ingham County. And I really believe that Kyle Stevens was the one who really set the tone for things. Up until now, all of the survivors, or most of them I should say, had Jane Doe identities. And Kyle came forward and she used her name. And what that meant was that we could all use her name. We could photograph her, radio could use her voice. Up until now, we had been in other courtrooms and we couldn't use their names. And there were even a few times when we were asked to leave the courtroom and maybe there was a pool reporter. So this was really important that someone's face and name, someone allowed their face and name to be used. And after Kyle set the tone, the next person who came forward was Jessica Tomasha, and she also allowed her name and her face to be used. And the next was Jade Campo. And Judge Aquilina, as you probably all recall, allowed women to come forward, women and young girls, and say what they needed to say. So Judge Aquilina also played a critical role in what happened a year ago in January. And by the end, there was 2 counties, there was more than 200 young women, and almost all of them shed their Jane Doe identity. And I really thought that was a pivotal moment in history, in women's history, in the sexual assault movement, and it was also a perfect storm because, as I mentioned before, cameras were rolling, people were taking pictures, people were tweeting, we were live tweeting throughout these testimonies. I mean, people around the world were riveted. We were so busy. I remember giving interviews to the BBC, and I gave an interview to a radio station in New Zealand. They were talking about Larry Nassar in New Zealand at the time. So I stayed up there longer than 4 days. I stayed up there 9 days, and I went back again and again, and I've been at Michigan State many, many times since then, and I really do think that that was an important time. And the reason, I would argue that Larry Nassar and all that happened was probably one of the most pivotal, one of the most documented sexual assault cases in our history. And I do think that how news is more accessible nowadays is what contributed, because once upon a time, the first woman who came forward was Rachel Den Hollander, and she talked to the Indianapolis Star. And there used to be a time before the internet when maybe only people in Indiana might have read her story. But because of how you can get news now, people start seeing it and hearing about it, and people start coming forward, and that's how I believe that this story really kind of resonated in the communities. It was up against the backdrop of the Me Too movement. It came kind of right about in the middle of it. And there was talk then about Harvey Weinstein. Women were coming forward and lodging, telling stories about things he had done, as well as Bill Cosby. But Tarana Burke, she was the creator of the Me Too movement. She said, I watched some videos of her and heard her talking about things. She said that sometimes the media create what she called boogeymen. Basically, maybe people who we might just all be afraid of. But when in fact, a lot of men like Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein and Larry Nassar, they're representative of a lot of men out there who are doing the same thing. In fact, Rachel Den Hollander said that Larry Nassar is just a drop in the bucket. So at the end of 2017, when Nassar was starting to be called a monster, I remember thinking about Larissa Boyce, who talked about how she had told Kathy Klages in 1997 about Larry Nassar. That was a long time ago. So I proposed to my editors in December to write a story about all the women that had come forward and talked to about Nassar. We had this big meeting, and we talked about it, and we talked about how we might do it, and we decided to publish it around the time when the testimonies started. And that was right around the holidays, and there was a lot of work to be done. And I did write this story that came out about what MSU knew, and it came on the third day of testimonies. And at the time, I don't think I realized what was happening, but we talked to women like Larissa, who was one of the women, and another woman called Christy Achenbach. And we tracked down the people that they said they told. Kelly Burt was a coach that Christine told. We talked to Tiffany Thomas Lopez, who was another woman who said she told her trainers, and we tried talking to her trainers and asking what they said. We talked to Kyle Stevens, and the psychiatrist, she said she told Dr. Stolak. We talked to Brianna Randall Gay, and how she told the police. We talked to Amanda Tomashow, and of course Rachel Den Hollander, and we put it all in one story. And we tried to talk to everyone who they said they told, including Christine Moore, Dr. Strambles, Cohen. And one of the last people I talked to was in court on the second day, and it was Luann Assignment. At the time, I didn't think I really understood what I was doing, but one of the things that Tarana Burke has said is that, we often do talk about the boogeyman, but we don't talk as much about the cultures, or the institutions rather, that enable them. And I don't think I understood at the time that that's what we were really doing, but that's kind of what started to happen, and that's probably one of the most important things to understand. And we've been continuing that conversation and keeping the focus on the institutions, as I'm sure you're all knowing. There are other institutions besides Michigan State. There was USAG, USA Gymnastics, and USOC, and Twistars. As you all know, Luana did resign on the first night, or the same night as Lasser was sentenced in Ingham County. We thought it was important to kind of write deeper stories about some of the people who were accused, because in journalism, you know, a lot of us that we were covering this, we all went to like the board meetings. You know, that's expected of us as journalists every day to cover like what we call spot stories. We went to the meetings, but you're also required to write stories that maybe we call them enterprise stories. So we thought it was important to, you know, write stories about, you know, some of the people who were accused of being told years earlier. So we wrote some of those, like about William Strample, and we wrote about stories about, you know, how the AG was investigating and MSU was stalling them, and we knew that because we had filed a FOIA and we read through documents. Of course, we documented the year of MSU interim president Engler. But there were still a lot of things that we struggled to get, all of us. There were a lot of secrets, and there was a lot of hurdles to information. I know I did, and I'm sure my colleagues had a lot of difficult time reaching some board members. I'd call some board members and they wouldn't call me back at all. We had troubles getting documents from MSU. It would take weeks, sometimes months. At one time, MSU's communications department only had an answering machine, and you could only reach them via email. I mean, that's changed now, but you know, that was one of the hurdles me and my colleagues all faced. I wrote this one story. We had FOIA emails about people who had written to Luana Simon at the height of the scandal, because we wanted to know what people were saying, and it took till November for us to get them. So yeah, that's really telling of how, you know, we were fought on a lot of this. Another one of the issues that I struggled with, and we've talked about, is language. Often people have talked about sexual assault under the guise of treatment. That's kind of how we portray it. But I've often argued we should at times, you know, put more detail in, because, you know, 20 years from now when you read the paper, what does that mean? Sexual assault under the guise of medical treatment. And I've struggled at times to get some more language in the paper that's a little more specific, not to be exploitive, but to help people understand what happened here. Because I've often felt that if, you know, someone's going to be in court, they're going to be brave enough to speak, then they should, you know, we should use their language. And I pulled up a few tweets during the prelim and how I was, you know, I was tweeting what, at the time Kyle was anonymous, but words she was using, I mean, she was using words like masturbation and penis, and, oops, I messed up. But my story ended up being, I think it's a slide, a couple down, that we used words like his groin, and they were just different words than what were used during some of the testimony. So that's been a struggle I've personally had in the newsroom. Another struggle we've had is that you know, it was such a busy time. We were so busy working around the clock covering the news that it was hard sometimes to write like what we call softer stories, feature stories. And I did speak with Valerie Von Frank when she put up all the ribbons around campus, and I remember calling her up. I'm like, sorry, I've had a breaking story, but I'm going to write this story. I think it took me 2 months to write this story about all the ribbons that were around the trees. But, you know, so it's sometimes been, but those are important stories because they're important to explain how the community was, you know, honoring the survivors. Let's see, that was slide I messed up. And also another struggle I personally had at the paper is using the word survivor versus victim. There's been debate in our newsroom about, you know, the language, and we can't, at least at our paper, use the word survivor in text. It has to be in a quote. And, you know, we've been talking about it. It's an ongoing conversation. I've argued that language has evolved. There's, I mean, we have new words in the dictionary where, they're from the tech culture, and there are people in the HIV community that took them a long time, but they convinced us to use the word survivors, and but it's something that we've talked about a lot in the newsroom. And I'm just going to end with saying that, a lot of people have said to me when I tell them that I've covered the Nassar scandal that must have been really hard. And, I often say that, it was a really important part of history, as I started out by saying, and I feel really honored to have been part of chronicling that history. And I really do believe that one day we're going to look back and in the history books it's going to talk about this time here, about when all the survivors did come forward and talk about sexual assault. So.
Kozlowski, thank you very much. Matt Mencarini, a story in your own backyard that occupied an awful lot of your time. We have read thoroughly, climb out, what you've written in the Lansing State Journal. I'll keep extending this one. And thank you for the depth of your coverage.
Well, thanks for having me. I'll try to keep this kind of short. Hope to get some questions later. A couple of things I want to touch on. One, I want to talk about how the LSJ covered this, how we approached it from the start to where we are now. I want to touch on something that Kim mentioned, victim versus survivor. Kind of explain why reporters choose each of those words. Because I think it's important to pull back the curtain on how media and journalism operates. And then the final thing is it's going to be a pitch and a request to all of you. So the first thing I want to talk about is how the LSJ approached this story from the very beginning. Because fortunately we're in the same company as the Indy Star, before they published their first story, in between their USA Gymnastics piece and the first Nassar piece, I was put in touch with the reporters down there as a local contact that they could have for any background checks and general info. That was in late August, and then early September, the 12th or whatever, it ran. By the second day, we had the MSU police telling us there were more people coming forward, and we had local prosecutor telling us there were more people coming forward. So it was very clear at that point that this was going to be, at the minimum, a very high-profile local criminal case, that we were going to cover gavel to gavel all the way to the end. He was fired on the 20th, and that's when we found out about the Title IX investigation in 2014. When we found out about that, the shift went from about him to about the institution. And that is what drove our coverage all the way through. We covered the court case and every twist and turn, motions and briefs and all that. We were focused on the institution, and I had editors who, every time I began to go down a rabbit hole of his medical procedure or something that was off of the institution, would twist me and point me back, because that's what we felt in the long term was going to be the important story. Is not what he did, it's what the institutions did in response or to prevent it. When I talk to a lot of victims and try to have them tell me their story and go on the record with it, one of the things I tell them very early on is not to diminish what happened to you. It's awful, it's important, but my story is not about what happened to you, it's about what the systems in place did or didn't do to respond or prevent it. That, I think, is what makes journalism more than just regurgitating someone's story to something that can have an impact and hold powerful accountable. So that was our focus the whole way through, is the institution. It was a very long process, about 150 FOIA requests over 2 years, 350 stories, just the LSJ, that's excluding everything else that the reporters here did. It was a slow churn to get there, and I think that is, people don't always realize. It became an international story in January of 2018. It was all out there. It took 16 months of reporters constantly going at them to pull this stuff back. I mean, I don't know.
It's just hard for people back there to hear.
I didn't say anything important, so don't worry. It took 16 months to get from a point of we know about him, he's been fired, to actual change at the university. And I sometimes think that we were to blame, the local reporters were to blame, that we didn't get the word out there enough. I just think it's the reality of the situation, it took as long as it took, but our focus again was on the institution. Quickly on the victim versus survivor thing, I've said victim, I've heard myself saying it when I'm standing up here. You know, Kim talked about it, they're not allowed to use it unless it's in a quote. We've not had that specific discussion in the LSA newsroom, but I think it's important to explain why we pick victim and stick to that. And it's not to say someone isn't a survivor. We need to be impartial. I'm not on your side as a victim, I'm writing your story, I'm not on your side. I'm not an advocate for you. I'm there to tell your story, to seek the truth. Adding that survivor tag to someone, in my mind, and I think most reporters, the general thought is that steps into the advocacy realm. I'm giving attributes to someone, and that's not my role. I've talked to victims who describe that there's this process to go from victims to survivor. As soon as I begin to say you're a survivor, then is this other person not? You know, how far does that tag go? Is it just sexual assault? Is it domestic violence? Is it child abuse? Is it other forms of trauma? And so that's why, as journalists, we have at the LSJ, and I know most of the reporters who cover the story have gone with the victim. It's not that we don't care. It's not that we don't view them as a survivor. It's that we need, when we can, to be a little impartial and to be a kind of unattached, cold, here are the facts. And if we can convey your actions and your words and what you went through and people view you as a hero or a survivor, that's the goal, not for us to say this is what you are. And I'll end with an ask, a request. Everyone up here, the reporters are all local reporters. This was a local story for 16 months. Local journalists were on this story long before the national media was. And I would just ask you to support local journalism, newspapers, radio, TV. Donate to the nonprofit. It's really important now when we're fewer resources, less money, all that. There's a lot of newsrooms in the state that committed to this story, and it was not a story that we made money on, probably. There's a lot of money sunk into time and resources and FOIA requests. And so just please support local journalism. Lansing, Detroit, throughout Michigan, wherever you are, please support local reporters. So.
And thank you very much, and thanks for providing a different perspective on how journalists have covered. For those of you who are way in the back and may have a little trouble hearing, we'll try to project, but also there is a side gallery here. If you wish to come forward, there's some space over in the gallery if you want to hang there.
You can even come around through the back galleries and you'll be able to hear much better.
We'll try to use our big voices here. Those of us who are broadcasters. And the next one is a broadcaster. Alexandra Illitch, for 4 years at WLNS, covered the story. She is now independent with Veracity. Alexandra, please come forward.
Thank you for having me here today. I appreciate it. So I can be a little blunt. I'm just warning you. I'm just blunt and honest. It's just kind of who I am. So I just wanted to put that out there. So covering Larry Nassar scandal here really taught me a lesson. It's that I really enjoy investigative reporting. And I actually, when this started, was kind of new at reporting. I had graduated from MSU in 2014, and I was just kind of getting my feet wet in the newsroom. And I got a job right away, so I had only been really in news for 2 years. It taught me a lot, and some of the things that I'm going to be talking about are the challenges that I faced, what appear to be some failures in government, and understanding how to maintain a person's dignity while also revealing that they're a victim of sexual assault. I learned a lot about the Freedom of Information Act, and more specifically, just so you know, the cost of transparency is incredibly expensive, especially when you're fronting your own FOIAs. So I was paying at times around FOIAs until I fought for some money to get those FOIAs paid for, but it's incredibly expensive. It also taught me that the importance of being a journalist is about asking tough questions. And also challenged me to find answers, regardless of whether it's the popular thing to do, because oftentimes people don't like to ask the tough questions. It also taught me to question everything. I now question the pen that I write with, no matter where the information is coming from, and it's also very important to fact check. And that means you have to do a lot of reading, even at 3 a.m. after a really long day, just to make sure that you're fully understanding things and then writing it out to the public. The story in and of itself is incredibly complex, and that can create a lot of challenges, especially when the case is widely reported in the media. It can be both positive and negative, in my opinion, and that's because I have respect for the law and criminal justice system and the integrity of investigation. So it's kind of like a catch-22 here. When you're constantly reporting on a case that's supposed to be dealt with in court, it has the potential of compromising the integrity of an investigation. So we have social media, obviously, and as a lot of the reporters have talked about, this was being tweeted out, and actually keeping up with Matt in the very beginning was very hard too, because you know, when you're covering a case and you're filing stories about lawsuits, that doesn't happen every day on different stories. With that being said, there's something to be said about public pressure. People don't like to look bad. And when you start exposing things in the media that have been covered up for decades, sometimes that's what gets people talking and doing things. And while it's intended to, you know, it's important to keep things in the arenas that they're intended for, like court cases in the court systems and certain stories, but that is something that I think I've learned from. If it weren't for a lot of the reporters covering this case, and like Matt said, for the 16 months to kind of get it to the to where the case moved to the national level, I don't think we would be here today. It also is not always a good thing because the problem doesn't always get fixed. If you tell the public you're doing one thing, but from the inside you're doing another, it's incredibly misleading. It's also incredibly damaging for the victims and their families. People silently suffer, and there's way too much of that still to this day. To be honest with you, it's one of my main motivators. I hate being lied to. I can't imagine how all of these individuals part of this case feel. So one of my main motivators is to find the truth for them, because that's what I'm supposed to do. To this day, I'm still uncovering information related to a 2014 Title IX investigation that MSU handled. That's after there's been several public statements about it. If MSU had just come out and admitted some of its downfalls related to this particular 2014 case, well, I wouldn't have to be telling people about certain things. People often say to me, Allie, people don't care about this anymore. Why are you still covering this? I'm sick of hearing Nassar. I'm sick of hearing about MSU. Why can't you cover the positive things that are happening at MSU? And there are positive things happening at MSU. But specifically related to this, the truth isn't out there yet. Not all of it. So how do you fix a problem when only certain information is released? Or maybe not even released at all? How do you fix a problem when there isn't transparency? You don't know what you don't know. And when you're digging for information based on what both sides tell you, sometimes you follow a certain narrative because you're only getting certain information from both sides. It's hard when you're only getting some information from this side, some information from this side, and FOIAs, like Kim had mentioned, takes months to get back. So the narrative for any aspiring journalist, just know that the narrative may not always lead you to the truth. Some people will tell you one thing, another person will tell you another, and then you'll find maybe through a FOIA request that neither side is telling the truth about something. Another thing that this case also taught me is to have respect for victims of sexual assault. People who come forward and tell their stories are humans. You can't force someone to come forward, and you also have to delicately handle details of their story. You never want to re-victimize a victim, and that can be incredibly challenging to navigate through, especially when you want to just give a voice to someone who deserves to have one. You also have to realize that there's shame in coming forward. It's a very personal thing. So that can be incredibly embarrassing for some that express that to me. I mean, if you think about it, imagine telling someone your deepest, darkest secret and then having that deepest secret be put all over the national media. So with that said, a victim's story matters, but so does the other side of that story. It's incredibly important to be fair and honest. Just because someone is a villain does not mean that their constitutional rights go away. They shouldn't be violated, and they still have a voice. That side still has a voice, their side of the story. So there's something to be said, though, about an institution, especially a public one, being held to a higher standard. So I guess my message to you would be to not forget that. Everyone has a side of the story. Take time to get that side of the story, regardless of what the topic is. Thank you.
Alexandra Illitch, thank you very much. Judith Waldron, School of Journalism. Let me turn next to you with your photos and your stories.
Do we have a clicker?
We do indeed. We have a clicker.
All right.
And you've got a microphone.
Oh, that's scary. I'm loud without it. Just this button, do we know? And this slideshow. Sunny!
Yeah, you gotta pull up your.
I'm a Mac person, of course, the creative in the room.
Is there a young person in the house?
No! Oh, wait.
Is this you?
Yeah, that's me.
There we go.
So I'm gonna rip through this actually and just get down to the visuals. And I'm not quite sure,
Okay, then just pull the next button.
this one?
Yeah,
Cool.
and then you can just,
I'm technically savvy, believe it or not. So my name's Judy Waldron. I am new to MSU. I'm a new faculty member in the journalism school, and photojournalism is my area. I'm a visual storyteller and a visual communicator, and I've worked for 30 years now. As Kim and I were kind of breaking down our time, it's weird how that happens. Telling stories such as these, whether it's domestic violence, trauma because of war and famine, things like that, but you know, always trying to humanize these stories in the media. And I have to say, after hearing all of you talk, it is such a relief all of a sudden to be a professor right now and not to actually have to be in a newsroom and thinking about not using the word survivor and having to use victim. That was always a difficult thing for me to navigate. And to feel like I can be an advocate and be open about it, even though I was kind of a closeted advocate as a journalist. So what I'd like to just briefly talk about is how people, survivors, are portrayed in the media, especially in the landscape that we have today, right? When you have people working at media companies that are stretched beyond their limits. The way the newsrooms I used to work in had 900 people when I started at the Dallas Morning News in 1987. That newsroom now has, I believe, something like 62 people left, right? And so what you have are newsrooms and editors making decisions around what is clicky, what is going to get the advertising dollar, what people are going to want to read and what they're going to see. A lot of that is what's driving what we are covering, okay? And visually, the first group of people, as we're finding out, after the copy editors and a lot of the designers, are the visual storytellers, right? The ones that bring to life and put a face on the people who the writers are talking about. And for me, that's been very, very heartbreaking, okay? Because what I see is a non-holistic coverage, non-long-term coverage visually of stories like this, okay? They take photos, you know, obviously this was the first wave of photos when we see, you know, these courageous survivors in the courtrooms confronting a monster. So these photos were taken, they were circulated, et cetera, et cetera. And then the story continues, and so the grids continue, okay? And what I slowly started realizing is that I know Larry Nassar's name, but I'm not getting the names of the people who I need to get, right? And the sheer number of people that were coming forward was overwhelming, and I know that would have been really difficult, but I was starting to lose touch with these human beings as individuals, right? They were being grouped into this, we are victims of Nassar, and we just keep hearing Larry Nassar's name, but we're not hearing their names, and for me that is very frustrating. And again, you know, I understand that newsrooms are taxed. I understand that the visual teams have been fired or laid off or their jobs have been eliminated. But I'm here to say that there is strength in visuality, there's strength in photography, and there's strength in still photography versus video. One of the points that I had written down in an earlier slide that I skipped over is that more and more newsrooms are getting rid of their still photographers in lieu of videographers because Facebook, first of all, lied about the amount of engagement that they were getting on the videos that media companies were posting. But secondarily, they can charge advertisers more money to have videos posted. Would they have that awful, you know, advertisement that lasts for longer than the videos, called a pre-roll, when you watch them? The problem with switching from stills to video is that it takes a commitment from the viewer to watch the video, right? I don't know how many of you are at work and you're skimming through the news, you're not doing your job, you're being naughty, you're kind of, you know, surfing the internet. You don't really stop and watch a video, right? But that's how your visual content is being delivered to you. So the second wave, so the first wave was these amazing, courageous survivors in the newsroom confronting Nassar. And then the second wave of photographs, when you Google this, comes from the incredible ESPY Awards, right? Amazing. Now, when I was looking at the still photos of the ESPY Awards, I didn't get this feeling of amazement. I had something that reminded me of beauty pageants and things like that. And this is in no way derogatory about ESPN or the ESPYs or how people were dressed. But watching the still photography, for me, I wasn't getting the courageous speeches that were coming out of this amazing event until I sat and committed to watching the video, which we will not do because it's too long for us tonight. But I highly encourage you all to watch the ESPY video. It just brought me to my knees when I was watching it. So very few still photographs I could find of this. But again, groups of women, groups of courageous survivors, but no individualization. And this one struck me and it basically infuriated me, I have to say, where you have Entertainment Tonight writing, survivors of Larry Nassar's sexual abuse gather in breathtaking show of unity at ESPYs. I was just like, there's his name again, and so I'm starting to get more and more angry. And then Mark Oslander sends me this. He's like, have you seen this? And my head just about exploded off of my body. Yeah, I think on first glance, everyone's probably saying, well, why? You know? But at second glance, I read photographs. I don't just look at them, I actually read them. I'm looking at the semiotic meaning that the color of the shirts transmit to me as an American, which is innocence and femininity. And then I look at the photographs gridded again together. I know that this must have taken an incredible amount of time and effort on the behalf of the survivors, and I don't know if anyone in here was involved in this shoot, but the people who I've talked about just said it took a lot of time, a lot of effort, and it was very difficult to pull this off. When I look at it, what I'm seeing are a number of faces, again, of courageous individuals that an art director decided, okay, we need to emphasize the numbers, because the numbers are a big part of this story. But it's been a big part of this story now for a friggin' year, you know? Let's move on. And that's just kind of where I'm coming from now. It also beckoned back to the coverage of Bill Cosby in New York Magazine. And every time I looked at the Glamour article, right, I kept thinking back about the New York Magazine article and the use of the color black. And the idea, is black more powerful than white, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Does black speak to power more than white speaks to innocence? I don't know. I'm just putting it out there for you all to think about. So I think ultimately, then at page 10 in Google, I came on the Sports Illustrated shoot. And this somehow is incorporating both to me, right? You have Standing Strong and you have these women, and all of a sudden they're confronting the camera. They're wearing a powerful color. They're facing you, right? Their arms and their body languages say, I am not a victim. I am a survivor and I'm a badass. And I think one of you had this quote too, but don't let anyone rewrite your story. Your truth does matter, and you matter, and you are not alone. So that's something I started thinking about after I watched the SB speeches. And thankfully, I was able, through the help of Mark, to get involved with the Army of Survivors, right? And I went to an event that they had at a Methodist church in Okemos and said, listen, if any of you all want to collaborate on a portrait with me, I'm your girl. And so many people came up and said, that would be amazing. And again, as a journalist or working in a newsroom, that would have been forbidden, all right? Because we're not supposed to collaborate. We're supposed to take the photograph. We're not supposed to show it to the people who we're photographing because that's not objective. And then we publish it. And that's how it worked for me for 30 years. And so I'm free of that now. And if I was still working in a newsroom, I'd be pushing against that. Because I feel strongly that you as survivors need to have agency in the way your images are being published, taken, created, whatever. So that's what I'm doing now. So this weekend, this is Jade. Badass. This is Marta, who credits her daughter for giving her the courage for standing up and speaking out. She wanted to be photographed as a wreck. You know, her daughter is a wild one. She can barely keep her hair in the hair thingy, as I call them. Amanda, right? Amazingly courageous, as is her mother for letting her speak. By the way, this is Alex, who I photographed this weekend in Chicago. So she teaches little children how to dance, and she was throwing up veils, and we just kind of settled on this. I mean, we're spending 3 hours, we're looking, they're liking it, they're hating it, and we're changing. The experience for me has been transformative. This is Ashley and her therapy dog. Amazing. And they all have a hand in this. And so for me, it's really challenging, right? You can see there's an individuality here with these photographs. You can also see, if you actually get a chance to look at them, that they're complicated, right? That they want to be shown as being strong women, strong young women, but they also, that came at a price. And a number of them have said this to me over and over. I am strong, but it has been very, very hard on me. And it continues to be. This is Danielle, talk about us. She's amazing, amazing person. And she said, can you photograph my tattoos? Right, so a broken Olympics ring. Mimi will be president. Mimi's mother, Colleen, amazingly courageous. This is Emily, who a friend of mine photographed. My friend of mine in Florida photographed Emily breastfeeding her daughter, which is the place where she finds solace. Katie, amazing human, was on the older end of the spectrum, she said. You know, again, the media has kind of visually portrayed the survivors as all very, very young women. You know, Emily was just repeatedly mistaken for being a mother, which was deeply humiliating for her. And then Louise, who's incredible. Louise Harder and her mom, Cynthia. We went back and forth about whether or not to photograph Cynthia with Louise or not, because Cynthia was she was like, oh my God, I look in the mirror and I don't know who's looking back. And I'm like, well, join me, because I'm the same. You know, we look at each other and then we were like, oh my God, you know, 55 or something weird that happens with the mirror. I don't know. So we put them in here together, and when Cynthia saw it, she got tears in her eyes, and she was like, wow, we look kind of okay. Like, maybe we're gonna be okay. Claire, you don't want to meet in an alley if you pissed her off. She's amazing. And she's still pushing on a few things, too. I'm proud of her. Gabby is, you know, she's working through it. Amazing human. We've got Jordan. Caitlin, I think this is the last one. Yeah. So Caitlin photographed her, and she said, would you please photograph my thigh, where she had been cutting herself for years. Yeah, pretty profound. So anyway, with that I'll stop. Just want you to think about visuality. I want you to think about reading photographs when you look at them, and fight. Thanks.
Judith, thank you very much. We will move the screen right now. Let's go from sight to sound. Reginald Hardwick is the digital news director at WKAR here on the campus of Michigan State, and jumped in essentially when he arrived several years ago to this story. So learning to maneuver not only being on the university campus, but also the story as well. Reginald.
Wow, good evening. I'm seeing everyone there on the stairs. Can you hear me okay? First, I want to just say I'm so inspired by survivors and victims telling their stories and telling their stories to the media and our fellow journalists. And, you know, so much light, whether it's the civil rights movement or whatever has happened in our nation. And it takes journalism sometimes to give that, to hear those voices that aren't being told and to give light, and that's what journalism does. About a year ago, I met Terry Gross. You probably heard her on Fresh Air, and I remember that the news directors were asking her, you know, what's her key to her success, and she said, inspire trust of interviewees by knowing and caring who they are. And like Sue said, I kind of came in here kind of, you know, after this story had broken and known a little bit about it in Texas, and I also am the news director, so unlike some of my colleagues have not been in the courtrooms, I'm the person kind of orchestrating the coverage from the newsroom, being the editor when the reporters need to look at stories. And I mentioned the quote by Terry Gross because I kept that as our North Star. And our North Star is a newsroom, just constantly thinking about abuse victims and survivors. And also a challenge for us is we were rebuilding our radio newsroom at the time. So we had been more dedicated to a daily magazine show, going into a more hard news type situation. I'd cover breaking news, I'd cover Columbine high school shootings and police shootings and these monstrous things that happen. But I think this is like a breaking news story that continues and continues and continues, and especially because we are based right here at Michigan State University. And what I didn't want to happen is, as I've seen happen before, is reporters parachuting into the story, and because we have a small staff, having to move on and then not being able to stay with the victims and hear their stories and really pronounce those and share those with the community. And I wanted to make sure we always kept the victims and our coverage first. One challenge we had is, well, we cover things digitally and social media, and you can almost put anything on digital, and there are very extreme elements of this story, and obviously the abuse. but we also are a public radio station. A lot of people have listening when they're driving home with their kids in the car, and some of the things are very hard to talk about, and some of the sound bites. And we also have the issue of time. So you only have so much time to tell a story or so much sound that you can put on the air. So those were challenges that we went through. You know, some things we would be only on digital, some of the details, or some of the more excruciating details, and then some of those we also had to be very aware, especially with our large family audience in the afternoon and in the morning when people have families in the car, and trying to explain to my staff what goes on air may be a little bit more different than what we can go into more detail digitally and online. We're also a small staff, and we're a public radio station, doesn't have a big budget for FOIAs. So a lot of times it is a matter of reaching out to partners, reaching out to different reporters and folks who had really covered this story a lot more in-depthly and had the resources to do that. So I know it was a few times I would call the LSJ and I would ask for Matt or some of the other reporters, or I know Kim talked to Scott Pohl a couple times, and we would reach out sometimes to our television partners to help us in covering this story and helping us also get a grasp of this, you know, story that's all around us. I will say that when these survivors spoke in Judge Aquilina's court and also in Eaton County, there was a seismic shift, as Kim mentioned. It is so courageous that they all got in front of the microphone, and sometimes these were covered by, you know, TV cameras were there streaming this on different social media sites, some of them, you know, putting them on different cable channels and telling their story to the world. And again, that was an opportunity for us to get to know who some of the faceless, you know, the people that have been affected, but obviously we're putting a face on them. A lot of those folks live right here in Ingham County. But to really understand and hear, and again, put their stories first. So many times in court cases, you hear the officials, you hear the prosecutors, you hear everyone but the victim, and especially in the cases of sexual abuse, because we want to be very careful. But for them to be so courageous and come tell their stories, it was a seismic shift, and I think a seismic shift that reverberated outside of Ingham and Eaton County, but all around the world. After the trials, and possibly because we're right here in Ingham County, and we are public radio and television, WKAR TV, WKAR radio, what a lot of people talk to us about, and what we get calls about and emails about is, where can we get help? So many people were not believed. So where do they go to hear someone who will believe them? Where are the resources in the community? And even though we have Google and Yellow Pages and everything out there, you know, we needed to go and do those stories and look at the community organizations that were welcoming and saying, where can you know, this is a place you can go. And through our genius of our general manager, Susie Elkins, and our senior leadership team, we decided both on TV and also radio and digital to do a number of stories that air. And I think if you watch WKAR World, you still see the 2-minute kind of stories every once in a while that show, that take you inside the different places, especially here in Ingham County, where people can be heard and believed and listened to and work through the issues and hear from other abuse victims. And that was a real way for us to, again, put victims first, survivors first. We're still dedicated to making sure that we cover all the fallout, all the administration issues, but I always go back to what I said earlier with the quotes before, believing and caring who the folks that we're interviewing are, and always putting them first, and always making sure our new staff does the same. So I'll keep my comments a little shorter.
Thank you. Joanne Gerstner, on the faculty of the School of Journalism at Michigan State, has an additional perspective because there is a sports component to the story as well. Joanne.
Got it? Yes, I got it.
I'm cool like the Oscars. I put my notes on my iPhone. I asked a friend of mine when we first heard about the Nassar thing, did we actually see this and not realize we knew it was happening? I've been to the Curly Ranch. I've been to Cincinnati Gymnastics Mary Lee Tracy. For those in the gymnastics community, you'll know what that means. I've been to 2 Olympic Games. I've been to 3 Olympic trials. I have seen the Curlies scream at people. I have seen John Getter humiliate Jordan Weaver. I have seen things here at Michigan State. I also see Tom Izzo on the sidelines screaming at his players. I also see umpires get into it with managers. This is our culture. This is sports. And when I hear the scuttlebutt of, well, where were the parents? Why didn't the coaches do something? Where were the officials? Well, I can answer that. The culture we have built in sports actually worked against anyone coming forward. And simply put, as a former athlete myself, the one thing you learn, and God knows, gymnasts, skaters, divers, the amount of punishment they take in their bodies in repetition to perfect what they do, you're in nothing but pain. You learn to navigate the pain. You learn to use the pain. You use the pain to clarify your mind, push yourself forward, and oh yeah, if you're really good, and we'll give you an Olympic medal, and if you're Carrie Strug, we'll immortalize you forever getting carried off, having led Team USA on a really bad sprained ankle, and all hail Carrie for doing that. But we immortalize, glorify, and worship some of the elements that led to people not being believed, people not coming forward, coaching behavior that if it was done on the street would be a felony or a hate crime, depending on what was going on. It's sports. It's okay. The question is, though, if any of you have been an athlete, you don't think twice when your coach yells at you. They're there to help you make you better. When you get hurt, you go see the trainer, and they do awful things to you to pop parts of your body back in, and it's not fun. But you let them do it because they're going to get you better, right? And everybody has your best interest. And oh, yeah, you'll get the stage parents. You think some of those people would want to tell their parents that they're being abused when they're reaching the senior national team and the Olympics are next year? It's the perfect storm. So when this whole thing exploded, and I recognized every single person that was involved in it, both from the athletic training staff here at Michigan State, the athletic administration staff at this university, to USA Gymnastics, and now USA Swimming, and now USA Diving, and God knows what else, oh, USA Taekwondo. You really have to step back and say, we're no longer in the world of stick to sports. All of these people did amazing work, but unfortunately, I can't claim any of you as sports writers. You're all hard news people, and yay, we need you. But my sports brethren failed. Failed. For a number of reasons that were, if you're covering Michigan State athletics, you're covering football and basketball. You're probably not watching what the gymnastics team's doing. It's just true. Number two, and this is where it kind of gets into gender politics. Everywhere I worked, I have been either the only woman or one of 2 women on staff. So some of the people say, well, it's your responsibility then to probably cover this because we'll do the other stuff, but you're a woman, I don't want to talk to those women, as if a good reporter has to have a gender or an angle to be communicating with somebody on a level of empathy and effectiveness. There's still that built in. We love sports in this culture. We worship heroes. We worship those who triumph. And we are at a campus that the finest and best buildings are for the athletes, specifically football and basketball. which is fine. They make money, people donate, it's good. The difficulty I have as both a practicing journalist and now a professor in school journalism is when this came forward, my students were saying to me, but I love MSU. Why would I say anything bad about MSU athletics? I don't think the football team could have done anything wrong. What? Basketball? No, it's almost March. You don't want to get in the way of them winning the national title. And here's the thing, those are completely beautiful, innocent questions asked where you are in your maturity level at school. What I did was, I turned this an opportunity to talk about Penn State, Baylor, Florida State, and now Michigan State. This is way beyond a Larry Nassar thing, and there are amazingly courageous journalists, such as Paula Levine at ESPN, that are going against the system every day, and let me tell you, hell hath no fury like a sports fan wronged. I have read so many tweets directed at Paula and other journalists, which ironically enough, mostly are female, I don't know why this is happening, saying, you're a bitch. How dare you, you hate Michigan State. Michigan State, you leave us alone. Go destroy Baylor. Or, we don't believe you. Why are you finding these women? They're all gold diggers. They're just after us because we're successful. Or my personal favorite, you went to the University of Michigan. Paula went to Nebraska, so never mind. We're at a crossroads. We're about to enter into the holiest month for Michigan State sports fans. Big Ten tournament, March Madness. You saw what happened here on Saturday. You would have thought it was Easter, Christmas, Thanksgiving, and the 4th of July all rolled up in one. The mighty evil dragon of Michigan had been slayed, and we're all one in joy, which is great. But are we willing to confront what athletics can hide in terms of sexual abuse? And I'm very clear about this in my class. And I think this fits in beautifully with what Judy says. What we see visually burns into our mind of what, quote, a victim, a survivor is. A victim can be male, a victim can be female, a victim can be trans. It can happen anywhere, at any time, at any level. But I guarantee you, the farther you go up the ladder and the closer you are to making it, there is less incentive for you to say anything because you don't want to throw it away because your success has a lot of people around you. We have male hockey players who have been abused. The list is so long that I didn't want to write it down and put it on that screen and make our heads explode. Sports is hiding sexual abuse in plain sight, over and over and over, and things that we would call abuse, if it happened right here, we call good coaching, tough coaching, or suck it up, be a man, be a woman. So for me, this whole, whatever you want to call it, maelstrom, hurricane, has led me to teach differently. And trust me, some of my students who would much rather stick to sports, well, they're in for a rough ride. But they come around, and it's awesome. But I really just want you to think differently, and don't just bleed green and white, or maize and blue, or Honolulu blue and silver, but allow yourself to understand that we have a responsibility to hold this institution accountable, meaning sports. And for those who do come forward, to know that we believe them, we support them, and there are a lot of sports writers and journalists that do want to tell these stories, not just the hard news people, we're here too. So that's kind of where I'm at. So thank you for listening, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Judy. I too can use one of these, amazingly. And I'll use it to introduce our final presenter, Grace French. Grace is the president, the director of communication, and the researcher for Army of Survivors. She's a marketing coordinator, a change agent, an advocate, and a passionate mom. She was a plant mom. Sometimes I forget. Okay, I'll continue on. She received her bachelor's in business administration at the Ross School of Business, a minor in dance at the University of Michigan. Currently, she is working in downtown Detroit at Shinola, Detroit. Besides her work, Grace enjoys dancing, traveling, trying out new coffee shops, take that list from you, and playing with her puppy Bentley. Grace French, President, thank you very much. Please come.
I know we are a little bit short on time, so I'll make this slightly quick because I know questions are probably out there as well. So, can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I am not a reporter and I'm not in media. I believe that my place on this panel is to lend a voice and perspective to the other side of the story as a survivor who has had her story told a couple of times. I want to express my full-hearted thankfulness for each of these people sitting next to me. They have been incredible allies for the last 2 and more years and to survivors worldwide and have shown us what an impact media makes on conversations we have as a nation. They show us that perseverance of truth comes over titles, money, jobs, and more. Reflecting on my experience, my voice was taken from me when the abuse started at 12 years old. Through the 7 years of abuse, my voice was kept from me because I did not understand what was happening and couldn't express what was wrong or where much of my anxiety came from and couldn't say why I felt so uncomfortable in any medical situations. And I didn't get my voice back until January of 2018. It came because I started to hear other stories of girls who had similar experiences starting in 2016 with the Indy Star. And through the reporting of those sitting next to me, and even more reporters around the nation, and that's when the pieces all started to fall into place, and I realized where my voice was. From the first day that I told my story, it was amplified because of the women I was surrounded by, and the reporters, and the reporters who chose to continue to tell our stories. I grew up surrounded by media. My dad, shout out to Ron French back there, worked at the Detroit News, and now works at Ridge Magazine. My mom, hi Mom, worked as a reporter and then moved into educational development in the writing space there. I knew what it was like to see someone you knew well on television or in the newspaper or as the byline on books and articles. And there were moments when I was young when I happened to get a picture in the Lansing State Journal or another smaller local newspaper because of some activity that I was involved in. And those moments when I was young really were amazing. I would walk into school with my head high, knowing that people would come up to me and talk to me, and sometimes they would hand me clippings. But to be in the media as a survivor is a completely different story. Intimate details about yourself, how you responded, what you were doing, what you were wearing, are broadcasted to the world. People don't come up to you with clippings about your child's sexual abuse. People don't come up excited and say that they saw you on the front page. It's hard to see my story in media. The media I've worked with, thankfully, have been generally sensitive and informed, and I feel very well represented as I watch my story walk into the world. But of course, you only see a fraction of that story and the story that I told the reporters, and even a small and minuscule percentage of who I am. With my story on the front pages, I feel as if some of my friends in my community have begun to identify me by my trauma. And that isn't all of Grace French, and that isn't all of any survivor. It's hard giving up my privacy or my perceived identity, but I continue to do interviews and speak at engagements and fight because I hope that somewhere, somehow, I'm showing some other little girl where their voice is. In some cases, survivors are still not speaking out. I know of sister survivors who haven't told their loved ones about their experiences or talked publicly or even anonymously at all. They say they are afraid that they will be shamed. In our case, there has been an incredible outpouring of community support and even national support and a guilty plea, yet these survivors still feel like they will be shamed. With an army of 500 plus behind them, some survivors still feel their voices won't be believed. With most survivors, there's often shame, guilt, disbelief, and feelings of being unworthy because assaults take away our feeling of self-worth. There shouldn't be a shame on the survivors. There should be a shame on society for making them feel as if they aren't worthy of a voice. Only 1 in 4 incidents of sexual violence are reported. 3 out of 4 victims who are raped, who are victims of incest, who are sexually abused, do not report it. And why? Of 10 victims who don't report, 1 believes police won't help them, according to a study from the Department of Justice. Another one doesn't believe what happened was important enough. And another one believes it was personal. 2 of them fear retaliation, and 3 gave multiple reasons.
Maybe it's because we unconsciously or even consciously know that for every 1,000 rapes, only 5 perpetrators will go to jail. 5 out of 1,000. And that is not because of false reports. We understand that perpetrators of sexual violence are much less likely to go to jail or prison than any other criminals, and we know what we will have to go through to get there as survivors. The rape kits, the testimony, the personal attacks. There's a long history of women not being believed in this respect. Now, how does media play into that? Rapes and sexual violence are often not covered in the same way as other crimes involving bodily harm, until a major case with multiple victims or one that involves celebrities and fame is brought forward. While these cases are helping to change the culture around rape, many more cases might be known because when one victim is able to tell her story, others may see it and come forward. It's often only after other women step forward to say that they were abused by a perpetrator that a victim may realize they are dealing with a serial abuser. With the journalism that was done around our case, our community is able to make informed decisions on how to move forward to make positive, thoughtful, and educated change. Hundreds of survivors found their voice. It's important to note that the journalism done in this case was so different than many other cases covering this crisis. There's a huge amount of local coverage and national attention, and I think this definitely has to do with the fact that our case comes after the Me Too movement began. But our case never would have gone as far as it did if it weren't for the Olympic gymnasts involved and the fact that a majority of us were upper middle class white girls. In some ways, I think our story made headlines, national headlines, because of who we are and not what happened. I feel incredibly lucky in my experience, my story, and my sister's stories were told and amplified. But it does not get past me that this comes with privilege. Since the Me Too movement has begun, Matt has written a lot about our case, but he's also written an exceptional piece about Calvin Kelly. So raise your hand if you know about a dozen of victims raped over a decade by Calvin Kelly. A few. This case didn't have the same broad impact as ours did. We had advantages. The sisters spoke out, we were invited to court to speak, and what the world saw was a large group of middle to upper class white women. Our numbers certainly were impressive, but I think that we were more accepted because of our race. The 11 women Calvin Kelly assaulted were marginalized because of their race and because they mostly did not have the systems of support of the middle class. When a few cases were prosecuted, he was able to tell juries the women were just prostitutes, unhappy he didn't pay for them. We don't listen. Media, more and more, are also not being believed. But the free press is what helps to uncover stories like ours, and R. Kelly's victims, and Michael Jackson's victims, and Calvin Kelly's victims. We ourselves need to listen. I wonder where I would stand if my voice still lay dormant and I still could not explain the anxiety that I felt since I was 12. I know there are so many stories that have yet to be told. Media also can be a power behind sexual assault. The former president of Costa Rica is now being charged with sexual assault. A caller reported him after seeing Naxar court testimonies. She said that seeing women accuse powerful men like Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby of sexual assault and sexual harassment was inspiring, but as watching the gymnasts testify one after the other about sexual assault in the U.S. by the Larry Nassar that clinched her decision to come forward. So when stories are told, the impact is broad, but we need to make sure the impact for women whose voices aren't being heard now are heard moving forward. I hope that our community and our media understands how impactful they can be in lending voices to survivors. So I hope we all can take a hard look at the stories they are telling and we are telling and ask, how can I amplify survivors' voices and stories more? Who else can we empower with our conversations and the way we talk about survivors? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you to our presenters for these brilliant, stunning, and stirring stories. We've got time for 3 questions. 3 questions?
Can we ask you to come up to the mic, please, so we can, everybody can hear you,
And could you give us your name, please?
Yeah, sure. My name is Brooke Roslin. I'm a junior here at Michigan State, and I work in PR for the school right now, and I'm kind of trying to get some things shifted. I work with like OIE and SARB and stuff, and I was just kind of wondering, I know that this might be kind of a hard question to totally pinpoint, but if there was somewhere in the process that you can identify where it started to get messy, where people started to kind of start to slide it under the rug, because I'm sure, you know, it went through so many people's minds and so many people's ears before it got to somebody who should have done something larger. And if there's something that I or somebody else that's in one of these situations that does have a potential say in how things are being handled, where I should start to look and where I should kind of go from here in regards to fixing how MSU handles stuff, sadly, still correctly.
That's a good question. Matt, let me turn to you if I may. Can you hear back there?
So you mean messy in terms of like the PR response?
PR and just MSU's response in general, anybody's responses.
So I think the PR response was kind of messy from the start. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. So I said I think the PR response was pretty messy from the start, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that. It's a much longer conversation. But yeah, right off the bat, I don't think the university fully understood what was happening and what the story was going to be. So right off the bat, I think it was pretty messy. In terms of like preventing what happened, I think you go back to the earliest, I think 97, Larissa Boyce was the earliest someone says that they raised concerns. Stopping, I think it's there, and I think it comes down to just, if you are told, ask the next question, and do the right thing, and that's to refer to police, refer to someone in authority, and not brush it aside. Because people don't lie about this stuff, and so I guess where it went awry is the first time someone reported him or another abuser, and nothing was done.
Kim? Right.
That's a tough question, but I would agree with all the things that Matt had said. I agree that the PR response was not handled very well at all. I did mention that, like, for instance, board members would never call me back. I mean, that's first rude, but it's not professional. I remember when interim President Engler stepped in and he didn't address what had happened in the community. I mean, I think just small steps like that, where there were actually missteps, added up to things. As for how to change, I do think there's more awareness about what's going on here, but in terms of how the institution can respond, probably maybe more swiftness on requests for documents, less redactions. When I got all the documents from MSU of all the emails that were sent to President Simon, all the names of who had sent them were redacted, and I know we talked about maybe challenging on them, but there's a heavy redacting. It takes a long time, so maybe some more swiftness, but that's probably has to do with the legal department. I'm sure they're weighing in on that, but those are some steps that I think could be taken.
Is there another question?
Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you. I might ask a little bit about the culture of newsrooms that's been touched on. I mean, obviously there has been a great deal of sort of sotto voce discussion of sexual harassment and sexual abuse within news organizations, and also institutional pressures towards not asking some of the tough questions. And does anybody want to speak to some of the challenges to be a journalist of conscience, especially when there are market-driven concerns, especially, in a relatively small town like the one we're in, and which MSU is a major, obviously, economic force.
As a journalist, fight back. If your boss doesn't want to cover a story because MSU is going into March Madness, tell them to go pound sand. Do the story anyway and push back. Because the second you lose that as a journalist, you're biased. If you're not asking those questions, I mean, everything you said in sports, that's the biggest thing, and I'm just being honest, and I told you guys in one, in this town with sports, no one wants to talk about it. I had gotten into so many arguments when I worked at this TV station with my sports department. Why are you guys pushing this to news? Yeah, I want to cover it, but it's sports. So push back. Even if you're a woman, who cares?
Let's also ask Reginald to answer that, because institutionally, you're part.
Reginald, you're right in the middle of it. Yeah.
Well, I would say a couple of things. I think, just as Joanne said, there's a culture in sports, there's a interesting culture in media, and I came from a commercial television background, television news, so larger markets, and unfortunately, and with the growth of social media and people trying to monetize budgets and not do the hard work of being, it's terribly expensive to do investigative work and to pay investigative reporters and to keep them off the air. So it's very easy, I remember being in local TV news in a larger market, to not have those and let the newspaper do those stories or let the other folks do those stories. And unfortunately, now we're seeing newspapers now being really, really monetized. And I lived in Dallas, and I remember when the Dallas Morning News was so huge, and now, you know, they have fewer people than some TV newsrooms. And so we are seeing the decline of journalism and public media. I think we are really proud that we are doing a lot, but we don't have the foothold and the huge strength in numbers that more commercial stations have. We try to do as much as we can, but it is a cultural thing, and it is a cultural thing that places are trying to go after the entertainment news or go after things and not talk about the heady, important, investigative things. And I think it's across our culture as a country we need to deal with it. We need to deal with it as political issues. The R. Kelly story shouldn't have taken another documentary 20 years after it broke to be able to force some sort of dialogue in this country. And I think it's very similar. You see what Larry Nassar did, you see this continued trust of people in communities, because sometimes people are looking the other way or institutions aren't dealing with it, and you need journalism to make that happen. And unfortunately, with the monetizing, it's scary, that's not happening.
Let me ask the last question. And where, if anywhere, does the real story go from here?
Start there.
Okay, do you want to speak to that?
Wherever the facts go.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Right.
Where's the story go?
Where's the story go from here?
I mean, obviously, I'll just mention that here at the museum, we've been thinking more and more about institutional accountability. I think we started with the stories that were about individual sister survivors and then their collective voice, and that's important. But the Committee of Survivors and Allies has really pushed us to hold up a tough and relentless mirror to the very institution that we're in, and then to extend out to other patriarchal institutions, here but really thinking structurally, that's been the hardest part for us, because to not tell a story that's just about struggle and success and acting as if healing is done, because it clearly isn't.
Let me give thanks to our presenters again. Kate Wells, Kim Kozlowski, Matt Mencarini, Alexandra Illitch, Judy Waldron, Reginald Hardwick, Joanne Gerstner, and Grace French. Thank you all.